Hello, 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 and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. This week, we are diving back into the history of the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum, which, at some point, though surprisingly it was really difficult to pinpoint the exact year, had its name changed to the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton. We left off last week around 1918 at what appeared to be the initial success of Dr. Henry Cotton's surgeries to remove infection and cure mental illness. Something I didn't mention last week that is important to situate in the context of everything that was happening is that antibiotics hadn't been invented yet. And I know this is something that I take for granted when reading about this history about infections and surgeries gone awry. We know that infections and sepsis can be deadly if not caught in time. But for the most part, the anxiety around infections and surgeries has minimized because we have medications to help in the event that something goes wrong. Penicillin, though, wasn't invented until 1928, 10 years after Dr. Cotton was well into his surgical treatments. And that's something I think is important to consider as we discuss the next portion of this story. So, as with the last episode, I will be heavily using material from the book Madhouse, A Tragic Tale of Megalomania and Modern Medicine by Andrew Scull. So, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton. Dr. Cotton wasn't the only physician who had theories about the causes of illness. There are other names that you'll likely recognize that played a role in learning about the body during this time period. In Battle Creek, Michigan, the sanitarium there was run by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. Like the hospital at Trenton, the Battle Creek Sanitarium was quickly filling with patients, and Dr. Kellogg had his theories about what may contribute to mental illness. He, like others with whom he worked, believed in maintaining a healthy diet, since they suspected intestinal problems were the cause of illness. As Andrew Scull points out, quote, John Harvey Kellogg spoke loudly of the evils of consuming animal flesh and the virtues of fruit and fiber. Civilized diet, civilized leisure, civilized defecatory positions and practices had clogged the gut, flooded it with the most horrible and loathsome poisons, and produced the most damaging of outcomes, the civilized colon, an unequaled source of premature debility and death, end quote. You didn't think you'd get a gut lecture today, did you? But Dr. Kellogg came up with a plan to help his patients' diets. Along with promoting vegetarianism around 1894, Dr. Kellogg and his brother developed a fiber-rich cereal called cornflakes. The cereal helped promote intestinal regularity, and the patients seemed to enjoy it. So 2 years later, in 1896, a patent for the product was granted, and the newly founded Kellogg Company began producing cornflakes for a wider audience. So I had no idea about this early history to food that I've eaten for pretty much my whole life. But yeah, of course, with many people from this time period, Dr. Kellogg was super problematic. He was openly racist and discouraged any type of, quote, racial mixing. He was another proponent of eugenics and went as far as to co-found the Race Betterment Foundation, which hoped to form a eugenics registry. After Dr. Kellogg's death in 1943, he left his entire state to the Race Betterment Foundation, which was clearly a very good idea, since the trustees were later accused of squandering all the funds. The foundation was finally closed in 1967. So, what a legacy. Lord Joseph Lister of England was a surgeon whose research into bacteriology and infection led him to study the benefits of antiseptic cleaning of wounds. He would later go on to develop antiseptic surgical care procedures like basic sterilization of surgical instruments and making sure the doctor's hands were clean. These are concepts that are now so elementary, it's hard to even think about a time when it wasn't common practice. Lord Lister's practices led to fewer post-surgical infections and fatalities, leading him to be called the father of modern surgery. You may also recognize his name from the antiseptic mouthwash that now bears his name, Listerine. So I mentioned these two physicians not only because of their continued legacy today, but because they were contemporary successes that Dr. Cotton was most likely aspiring to. Dr. Kellogg had his cereals, and Lord Lister had his antiseptic revolution, if you will, and Dr. Cotton was determined to leave his mark on the field of medicine. And he wanted his legacy to be bigger and more important than his predecessors. Cotton believed, quote, drugs, diet, and other medical procedures, while they may have some effect on the condition of mental illness, do not correct the underlying trouble. Surgery, whether the resection or release of adhesions, is the only method which gives permanent results, end quote. So, you may recall from the last episode that Dr. Cotton began his surgeries at the asylum in 1916 by just removing teeth. His first 50 surgeries were not deemed successes, but he was undeterred and continued removing patients' teeth with the hope of producing different results. Dr. Cotton would later say that he and his team were too conservative in their extraction of teeth in the early days. Around 1922, he said, quote, "Today we feel as though a thorough elimination of oral infection can only be accomplished by radical extraction, or better still, surgical removal of infected teeth. And in deciding what to remove and what to save, the criterion was clear. If a tooth is at all suspicious, we are of the opinion that it should be extracted and not left as a menace after all of the other foci of infection have been removed. All bridges, crowns, pivots, and impacted and unerupted teeth were similarly threatening and must not be left in place to form reservoirs of infection. And because the abscesses and infection at the teeth's root often extended into the surrounding bony structures of the mouth, extensive oral surgery was essential to excise these further sources of sepsis, end quote. So just to reiterate, because that was a lot, he is advocating for the removal of all existing dental work, bridges, crowns, pivots, whatever that means, so that it doesn't create an infection down the line, because it could be a problem, not necessarily because it is a problem. So this idea of the infection spreading throughout the body, starting with the mouth, is a true slippery slope to what would come later. And indeed, by 1917, Dr. Cotton began removing tonsils, the next identified source of infection. This was done largely out of, quote, medical necessity, but patients often didn't consent to the procedures. Dr. Cotton boasted a 37% cure rate from his procedures. And I don't know about you, but I would want a little more than a 1 in 3 chance of improvement from a surgery I didn't consent to. So this period around 1917, 1918 is where Dr. Cotton really began to spiral out of control with the notion that patients had to be, quote, cleaned up of all foci of chronic sepsis. Andrew Scull notes that, quote, sinuses, tonsils, stomachs, gallbladders, colons, cervixes, and seminal vesicles, all of these and more might be potential sites of silent chronic infection leaching toxins into the lymphatic system in the bloodstream and poisoning the brain. And any or all might require excision by the surgeon's knife, end quote. Any or all might require excision. And before long, Dr. Cotton was removing multiple organs in the name of mental health treatment. According to him, this had miraculous results. Recoveries rose from 37% to 85%. Now, that may sound like a miracle, but skeptics wondered how it was even possible. No one had replicated these studies, and no one else was taking such drastic surgical measures like Dr. Cotton and the staff at Trenton. Still, Dr. Cotton was quick to promote his miracle cure to both the scientific community and the public. In 1918, he attended the New York Psychiatric Society and presented on the importance of, quote, extracting infected teeth, removing infected tonsils, and clearing up the gastrointestinal infection, end quote. He wrote a journal article on the same subject following the presentation, but wanted to appeal to the public before his article got published to his colleagues. So, what he did was submit an article to the Literary Digest, which was a public resource, along with his picture attached. He wanted the public's opinion and enthusiasm regarding his miraculous new treatment. The problem with this, of course, is that A, it sounds a whole lot like an advertisement, which is an unethical practice, and B, his procedures hadn't even been reviewed by the scientific community at that point. They could basically only take Dr. Cotton at his word, and he was packaging and selling his word to the public. This became a huge point of contention and the beginning of a lot of criticism toward Dr. Cotton from members of the medical field. Dr. Cotton had been able to maintain connections at Princeton University by teaching psychopathology to undergraduates there. So, in addition to the surgeries he performed at the asylum and his presentations and article writing, he was also teaching. I have no doubt that he was teaching his students about his alleged findings regarding the connection between focal sepsis and mental illness, and I just simply cringe to think about what they learned from him. Around this time, there was a shift in the view of mental illness around the country. Following World War I, veterans were returning with strange psychiatric symptoms: paranoia, depression, extreme isolation, sometimes hallucinations. This was referred to as shell shock, what we now know as PTSD. Suddenly, the people coming to the hospital weren't just poor, old, or addicted to drugs and alcohol. They were middle and upper class folks looking for a miracle cure to their ailments. And they weren't satisfied with the other hospitals who were merely housing them for a while with no results. And so the New Jersey State Hospital at Trenton began admitting wealthier individuals for a full medical evaluation and surgical treatment. One wealthy woman who was admitted to the hospital was Margaret Fisher, the daughter of economist and Yale professor Irving Fisher. Irving Fisher was someone who earned and lost the equivalent of about $40 million in today's money. He was part of the upper echelon of society and was lauded ideals such as prohibition, eugenics, dietary reform, and extension of the human lifespan. He was a big fan of John Harvey Kellogg from the Battle Creek Sanitarium as well. So when Mr. Fisher's daughter Margaret began babbling nonsense after her engagement in 1918 and talking at random about God, Christ, immortality, and responding to hallucinations, her family was concerned. They initially sent her to a private hospital, but she only got worse and she couldn't be controlled. So they sent her to the Bloomingdale Asylum in White Plains, New York. She was described as, quote, pensive and preoccupied, and at times depressed. She responded slowly to questions, and when aroused, was irrelevant, end quote. Her physicians didn't hold a lot of hope for her. As you may recall, mental illness was believed to be both incurable and fatal. But Irving Fisher didn't want to let go of hope. So 9 months after her admission to Bloomingdale, Margaret was transferred to Trenton on March 29, 1919. After a thorough physical examination, Dr. Cotton told Mr. Fisher that neurologically, Margaret seemed normal, but there was evidence of, quote, marked retention of fecal matter in the cecal colon with marked enlargement of the colon in this area, end quote. Margaret wouldn't basically sit still long enough to undergo an x-ray, and so Dr. Cotton was convinced that there were other infected areas that needed to be addressed. He found some sort of evidence that her cervix was eroded. He found 2 unerupted molars that he believed were causing issues, and he recommended a, quote, exploratory laparotomy based on her long-term constipation. Of course, having the advantage of hindsight, this all seems highly suspect. I would want to know how Dr. Cotton arrived at these conclusions, and for the love of everything good and holy, could we please get a second opinion? But then again, Dr. Cotton was touting himself as the expert of cutting-edge treatment, and people believed what he said. After all, he was offering hope, and that was something more than the other hospitals had given them. On August 15th, 1919, Margaret had her cervix surgically removed since Dr. Cotton claimed it was infected with colon bacillus. But when her surgery was completed and the symptoms remained, Dr. Cotton insisted the problem was her chronic constipation and recommended surgery for that. Mr. Fisher wondered if a diet regimen, laxatives, and some herbs might help take care of the problem. Didn't seem to help. So in September 1919, Dr. Cotton started a course of anti-streptococcal treatment and again recommended surgery. But something went wrong during the treatment, which Skull describes as, quote, the result of a failure to kill the streptococci before injecting them into Margaret's body, end quote. And by the end of October 1919, Margaret was showing signs of lung inflammation and, quote, a deep-seated abscess developed over the ribs on her left side, an abscess that, when lanced and cultured, gave pure streptococcus, the same type found in the teeth and stomach, end quote. So essentially, Dr. Cotton had infected Margaret with a dangerous bacteria. Her condition declined rapidly, and Margaret Fisher died on November 7th, 1919, at only 25 years old. So you might think that Margaret's family would be infuriated by their daughter's death, which was caused by such recklessness. But instead, Irving Fisher still had complete confidence in Dr. Cotton's method. He was devastated, but still believed that her mental illness had a physical cause. For years after his daughter's death, Mr. Fisher would support Dr. Cotton and his practices. And he wasn't the only one. More and more private patients began showing up at Trenton. People came from all over the US hoping for their own miracle cure. And Dr. Cotton continued publishing papers and attending national conferences, preaching about all of the successes he was having at Trenton. By 1920, even the governor of New York was on board with Dr. Cotton's claims. He put forth funds so that a resident dentist would be employed at every one of New York State's mental hospitals. While practitioners like Dr. Cotton firmly believed in the physical causes of mental illness, others had different theories. In Europe, the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society was populated by some of the greatest minds in psychiatry and psychology, namely Sigmund Freud, Carl Abraham, Carl Jung, Sandor Ferenczi, and my personal favorite, Alfred Adler. So, in short, psychoanalysis proposed that mental illness was complex and stemmed from experiences and deviances that occurred throughout the lifetime, but usually in early childhood. Now, say what you will about Freudian theories, but he wasn't entirely wrong. We know now that early experiences in life can have a significant impact on someone's later physical and mental health, for good and for bad. But for someone like Dr. Cotton, this amounted to psychoquackery. He still believed that somatic causes were to blame for mental illness, and he poo-pooed the beliefs coming from Europe and the Psychoanalytic Society. In fact, I think it made him dig into his own theories a bit more fervently. In January 1921, Dr. Cotton was invited to give a series of lectures over a 4-day period at Princeton University to an audience of about 400 people. Not only did he give his usual spiel about the dangers of focal infection, but he also connected his work to the prevention of crime and delinquency. He indicated that criminal behavior could also be rooted in disorders of the body, and that eliminating infected areas would reduce criminality. He offered 25 different examples of cases where a patient had had long-standing mental illness and saw drastic and remarkable recovery after surgery. Several months later, an expanded version of the lectures appeared in print. Dr. Cotton attended the 1921 American Psychiatric Association conference in Boston, where he was pleased to learn that colleagues who had resisted his ideas years prior were starting to show interest in his findings. He also visited a number of mental institutions along the East Coast, examining patients and demonstrating the practice of focal infection. Back in Trenton, Dr. Cotton was able to secure funding for 2 new psychopathic buildings at the hospital. The women's building was named after Dorothea Dix, the patron saint of American lunacy reform, and its male counterpart after Stuart Payton. Payton, who was an author of one of the top psychiatric textbooks and an honorary faculty member at Princeton, was thrilled to see his name associated with what he called this great hospital. The hospital was hailed as a place where restraints and padded rooms no longer needed to be used. Things were looking up for Henry Cotton. The publication of Cotton's 1921 Princeton lecture series drew both praise and criticism. Senator Royal Copeland from New York City had visited the hospital at Trenton and was very impressed by what he found. Dr. John Oliver of Baltimore saw Dr. Cotton's work as having, quote, immense value in educating the general public in their conception of mental disease, end quote. Others of Cotton's colleagues expressed their support for his work, including physicians from the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. Others, though, weren't as receptive. Even Stuart Payton, who had the building at Trenton named after him, warned about not neglecting the, quote, psychogenetic factors in mental disease, including the very important role played by mental hygiene, end quote. Still others, like Richard Hutchings, the superintendent of Utica State Hospital in New York, was concerned that Dr. Cotton was only looking at one facet of a complex problem. By the time of the American Psychiatric Association conference in June 1922, there was a lot of conversation about Dr. Cotton's work, and it was quickly deemed to be, quote, probably the greatest interest of the entire meeting, end quote. The first speakers were a duo, bacteriologist Nicholas Kopoloff and his assistant director Clarence Chaney, who wanted to investigate the claims made by Dr. Cotton. As any good researcher knows, the ability to replicate a study is a way to confirm or deny its accuracy. Kopoloff and Chaney faced some challenges in replicating Dr. Cotton's work, however. For one thing, they didn't operate as fully as he did, believing that it was unmerited. They attempted to set up a controlled experiment of 60 patients as closely as possible to Cotton's documentation, with some setbacks. As Skull points out, quote, they noted that they had not conducted abdominal surgery, considering it too risky, preferring instead to treat chronic constipation with doses of acidophilus milk, an approach they reported had successfully relieved the condition. Otherwise, they had x-rayed and examined, undertaken comprehensive bacteriological investigation, pulled infected teeth, removed impacted molars, undertaken tonsillectomies, and searched for gynecological sepsis, end quote. The results were disappointing. Even with a very generous definition of recovered, the overwhelming majority of patients did not see improvements. At the APA convention, Kopoloff and Chaney concluded, quote, we have no evidence on which to base a conclusion that the removal of focal infection has of itself brought about recovery. There is little evidence to indicate anything more than the gross relationship between particular species of bacteria and foci which have been considered, and little to suggest that the bacteria found are in any way causally related to the psychoses, end quote. In response, Dr. Cotton offered this rebuttal, quote, the successful treatment of 1,400 cases during the last 4 years, with only 42 return cases now in the hospital, must be accepted as evidence that our work is efficient. The fact that our recoveries in the last 4 years average 80% of this group against an average of 37% for the 10 years prior to 1918 should be convincing, end quote. So, as always, just believe me, because that's what I'm saying. Psychoanalysis A.A. Brill questioned the 80% recovery rate, wondering if he had performed operations on manic depressives during a period of mania, and that what they had deemed a recovery afterward was simply the end of a manic episode. It seems like a very reasonable question. The remainder of the conference served as sort of a back and forth regarding Cotton's theories. Many attendees criticized his work outright, while others took a more tempered stance, suggesting that there may be merit to focal infection theory, but maybe not used as intensely and liberally as Dr. Cotton uses it. By the end of the 1922 APA conference, it was suggested that a formal investigation into Dr. Cotton's claims and practices be started. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, Dr. Cotton welcomed the idea. After all, he had nothing to hide. Now, you might think that launching an investigation into experimental practices might warrant putting a halt to all the surgeries, but it didn't. Instead, by the end of 1922, the number of surgeries occurring at Trenton had noticeably increased. The number of colectomies rose from 81 281 from 63 procedures the previous year. Teeth and tonsils were removed increasingly due to more extensive and thorough exams. Many teeth were extracted as a preventative measure, not because they required it. Sinuses, stomachs, spleens, gallbladders, and cervixes were routinely removed as potential sites of infection. By December 1922, Dr. Cotton had appealed to the New Jersey governor for an increased budget due to the number of surgeries he required. Unsurprisingly, given the snafu at the 1922 APA convention, Dr. Cotton declined to attend the convention in 1923. Perhaps he gave an excuse that he was far too busy with his own work, and to his credit, sort of, Dr. Cotton was learning about less invasive ways of addressing infection. Instead of full colectomies, he had learned about what was called pericolic membranotomies. I think I said that right, which apparently involves the, quote, releasing of adhesions found around the appendix, terminal ileum, ascending colon, hepatic flexure, splenic flexure, and descending colon, end quote. I don't really know what all that means, but according to Cotton, there were 99 patients out of God knows how many who were recorded as benefiting from the procedure. And we can only imagine how they must have operationally defined benefit. And luckily for Dr. Cotton, the mortality rate was lower. Now, I haven't mentioned it up to this point for a reason, but Dr. Cotton was touting a success rate of 80% with his surgeries thus far. Actually, he said more like 80, 85, at one point up as high as 87%. What he failed to factor into that somehow was the average of a 30% death rate following the surgeries. And for some surgeries, the death rate was almost 50%. According to Andrew Scull, from 1921 to 1923, the total colectomies performed were in 133 cases, with 33 recoveries and 44 deaths. Partial resection at the right side was done in 148 cases, with 44 recoveries and 59 deaths. So, for those of you keeping score at home, recoveries among total colectomies averaged about 25%. So recoveries, 25%. Fatalities, around 33%. For the partial resections, there was a 30% chance of recovery, but a 40% chance of death. In every instance, the chance of dying was higher than the chance of being, quote, cured. So again, this is the psychologist in me coming out. I feel compelled to imagine what these patients were going through. They had been involuntarily committed to the asylum, given who knows what kind of physical examination, and taken away without their consent for surgeries that could result in a 30 to 50% chance of death. And certainly they would have seen the patients who survived and came back with scars, without teeth, maybe ill or weak, maybe telling horror stories of the procedure. I can only imagine, and it makes me sick to think about it. But regardless of how many people actually died, Dr. Cotton was still inflating the success rate. By 1924, he was boasting that 87% of surgeries resulted in the patient being recovered afterward. I don't know how he's determining these figures other than simply pulling them out of thin air, but to his credit, the adjusted surgeries, the pericolic membranotomies, had apparently been so successful that by 1924, the number of full colectomies had decreased to only 4 that year. And that's significant. A big break came for Dr. Cotton in 1924. After a rough couple of years, he was invited to speak at the Medico-Psychological Association of Great Britain and Ireland. Perhaps wanting not to have a repeat of the 1922 APA convention, Dr. Cotton brought graphs and charts and case studies to win over his audience. And win them over he did. They were enraptured by his presentation. Imagine a standing ovation for this guy. Physician after physician lauded Dr. Cotton for his contributions to the field. for providing such needed insights, and as one surgeon said, for presenting, quote, one of the greatest accomplishments connected with the subject of mental disease, end quote. No doubt this is what Dr. Condon wanted and needed, a renewed sense of vigor that his theories were valid and important. I can almost see his head growing as the praises washed over him. Of course, a megalomaniac can't be a megalomaniac without some extra drama and flair. He called the United States, quote, the land of the brave and the home of the once free, since he wasn't apparently able to cut out all the organs that he wanted to. And of course, he couldn't miss a chance to diss on psychoanalysis. Quote, I feel somewhat in the same way as the prodigal son who left his home and traveled to far lands, and for some years subsisted on the husks of other nationalities, especially the German. We were imbued with German philosophy and German psychiatry, much to our own detriment. And this meeting has shown me particularly that we should be in the position of the prodigal son, returning to the source of real science. When we get away from that metaphysical, fantastical, and otherwise objectionable theory of psychoanalysis, we come down to the facts, end quote. And then he went on to boast about the high recovery rate at the hospital and blah, blah, blah. He was basically a broken record and clearly unable or unwilling to hear any sort of different opinion. But he got what he wanted out of the meeting in England, which was validation and a renewed sense of purpose. And that's where I'm going to pause the story of Dr. Henry Cotton for today, with him on yet another professional high. But next time we'll discuss the promised investigation into Dr. Cotton's practices. And that really deserves a lot more time, so that's why I'm saving that for the next episode. You are not going to want to miss what they discover in the findings. And you're also going to want to stay tuned to find out who the investigator was, because they're going to get some extra time in a future episode. All right. Special thanks this week to all of you for listening and getting through the medical terminology and dissections and enucleations and I don't know, all that gross medical stuff. So thank you for sticking with it. Thank you for putting up with my lack of knowledge in the medical field. Psychology is definitely where my strength is. And big thanks to Ashley from Dallas for inviting a whole bunch of people to the Facebook group. Wahoo, get the MVP award of the week. If you're not part of that Facebook group and you want to be, send me an email at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com and request an invite. From there, you can invite friends, colleagues, people who might be interested in the show, people who are going on long car rides and need something to listen to. Everyone is welcome. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. And remember, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.